Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator, in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are honored to have author Rachelle Bergstein with us to talk about her book, The Genius of Judy, How Judy Blume Rewrote Childhood for All of Us. Hi, Rachelle.
Hi.
How's it going today? Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yes, we are super excited to have you. We have a lot of amazing questions that came in early. I'm sure we'll have a lot more live. With that in mind, let me pause for a moment and give that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. Like I said, we have compiled those questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you can continue to submit questions during the entirety of the talk. You click that questions button that's just below this live stream video. Keep in mind, we'll get to as many questions as possible. There are a lot of you tuning in today, so you can go ahead and start submitting those questions whenever you're ready. To formally introduce our guest for today, Rachelle Bergstein is a lifestyle writer, author, and editor focused on style, pop culture, and families. Her work has appeared in the New York Post, the New York Times, NPR, and more. She is the author of 3 books, Women from the Ankle Down, Brilliance and Fire, and The Genius of Judy. She lives with her husband and son in Brooklyn, and you can find out more about Rachelle at RachelleBergstein.com. Okay, now we can definitely dive in. Thank you so much for being here, I'm going to say again.
Yes, I'm so happy. Thank you.
So, reading your bio, looking at your bio, your first 2 books, one about shoes from the ankle down and one about diamonds, and now Judy Blume. So I'm going to ask you to share, of course, kind of a short summary of The Genius of Judy. But Karen from Central Arkansas Library System would also like to know what particularly interested you in Judy Blume and how does it connect to your work as a whole?
You know, it's funny. I've gotten this question a lot as I've been out here promoting the book, and it surprises me a little bit because to me, there is a through line between the 3. And I guess it's not instantaneously obvious because my first 2 books are more style and fashion oriented. But the thing that drew me to each of these topics is, what is it about this thing, whether it's a shoe or a Judy Blume book, that people, and particularly women, get so obsessed with? And why, when there are so many people who say that their lives are impacted or that they get joy from something, is it dismissed frequently as frivolous? So I think Judy Blume's books really very much fall into the same category. Maybe not right away, but when you start to think about it, you realize that so many people, particularly women, will tell you that their lives were changed by Judy Blume's books. And yet, when you scratch the surface of Judy's history, you realize that it took her a very long time to find credibility in the literary world. And even now, people are quick to say, well, Judy Blume, she's just a children's writer, and maybe underestimate her impact on the culture and particularly on the feminist movement, which is what I wrote about in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this isn't, so The Genius of Judy, it's not a biography of Judy Blume per se. Call it much closer to like a social and cultural history of not only her, but kind of second wave feminism and maybe its impact on Judy and the women reading as a whole. But of course, we have to ask, Allison from North Canton Public Library says, did you collaborate with Judy when you were writing this? And Allison's also curious whether Judy had any input or if you know what she thinks about the book.
Yeah, so Judy did not collaborate on the book. She has a pretty considerable archive at the Beinecke Library at Yale. So that was one of my major sources for this book. I spent many days just reading through the boxes. She has drafts and notes to herself and letters. I mean, just incredible things there. She did fact check the book. So we share a publisher, which is Simon & Schuster, and we were able to get her a copy of the book when it was still in copy edits. So if she had any sort of feedback, she was able to give it. Very stressful week of my life. Well, I waited to hear what she had to say, but in the end, she had no changes. So that made me feel really proud that I had at least gotten the biological portions correct. And like you said, in my mind, this book was never, it was never a straightforward biography. It was kind of a genre bending nonfiction book in that, it was going to use biographical information about her life, but also incorporate a lot of rich history about
Mhm.
her novels and also about the worlds that they came from.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so well done and such an easy read, and I mean, it pulls me back to some parts of my childhood and understanding the history, and the foundation for the way that my childhood was. So, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Sue wants to know, how did you research the woman Judy and the author Judy? They must have been kind of separate ways of researching. Did you have the same sources? Was it all that Yale archive?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, to understand, I guess the biggest challenge was to know the person, Judy, right? Because her professional life is pretty well out there.
Mhm.
Um, I read every interview she had ever done. I do a lot of library research through the New York Public Library through ProQuest. So, um, I was able to get a real sense of the arc of her professional and creative life. To understand her, yeah, the Beinecke was really an excellent source for that. I also, I spoke to people that she had worked with professionally. And she has a great book called Letters to Judy, which is her publishing questions that she received as a writer from children who wrote to her, and responding. But in the interstitial material in that book, she has a lot of biographical information about herself, sharing like her own foibles and struggles and things, that she ran up against as a child and a parent. So I was able to use that as well.
Great. So I can't imagine that you just one day were like, I'm going to write about Judy Blume with not knowing, with not having a background with Judy's books yourself. So Tracy from Crandall Public Library says, what effect did Judy Blume have on you as a young child slash preteen?
Yeah, it's so funny. No, I did not wake up one day and say, Judy Blume. Although, she was very much in the ether when I started writing this book proposal, and that was one of the reasons she was top of mind.
Okay.
Um, we're in the Blumessance. I don't know if you know, but the New York Times declared it the Blumessance a couple years ago. And yes, I mean, I have a very profound connection to Judy through my own childhood. I remember really clearly reading many of her books. And when I mean clearly, like I remember where I was, like where in my room I was sitting. That's how much of an impact they made.
Wow.
Um, my mom was a single mother. And so she had a friend with two older daughters who would give us tons of hand-me-downs just to help my mom out. So clothes, bathing suits, shoes, books. And I ended up, because of my age and the age of these girls, with a lot of like original Judy Blume paperbacks. So the copy of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, I read actually had the original menstrual belts in it. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, I don't think that's how it is anymore, but it not really mattering. I was sucked into the plot. But yeah, I mean, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, Super Fudge, Just as Long as We're Together, Blubber. I remember reading all of these books, and revisiting them as an adult for this project was really eye-opening. It was really, really interesting to go back and see what the younger version of me had responded to.
Mm-hmm. How did you respond differently as an adult, do you think?
Well, I tell a little bit of this story in my book, but I loved Just as Long as We're Together. It's not necessarily one of her most famous titles or one of her most appreciated, but for me, it was one that just really grabbed me at the right moment in time. And when I started reading it, I was still young enough. I want to say I was 9, that my dad read to me before bed every night, when I was with him. And I was so sucked into this book that I asked him to stop. That was the impetus for me to say, I want to read to myself tonight. And it was because, I didn't want to share Judy Blume with him. If any of you watching remember, the first line of that book is Stephanie is into hunks. And that's not the kind of book you want to read with your dad. And what I remembered about the book was that it was about 3 girls, their friendship dynamics, that spoke to me as a kid, like what's, trying to figure out the like confusing parameters of friendship, but when I went back as an adult and I read it, I was like, oh my God, one of the major storylines in this book is that Stephanie's parents are getting divorced and she's really, really angry about it. And my parents had just gotten divorced. And I'm sure that part of that book was speaking to me because it was reflecting feelings that I had kind of buried, so that was fascinating. It was like you find the book that speaks to you, even if it's only on a subconscious level, right? Like I never remembered the divorce subplot in that book, but it was really just a very eye-opening moment.
Just reminds me when I've been binging Ted Lasso a lot lately, and in preparation for talking to you today, it just stuck out to me immediately. Twice in the last season that I watched, they've referenced Judy Blume.
Oh, that's so funny. She's referenced everywhere. I'm trying to think. Yeah, so she's referenced in Easy A, like she's referenced in that movie. What is it? Is it maybe just called Ted, that talking teddy bear movie? I mean, she's just such a cultural icon. But that's fun. I don't remember the Ted Lasso, although I did watch that show.
Yeah. Well, one of them was Beard, and he was like, are you there, God? It's me, Beard.
Amazing.
Yeah. So Deborah from West Bridgewater Public Library is saying, your book is exceptional. I bought it for both of my daughters as a holiday gift. How closely do your ideas about sex and life in general align with Judy Blume?
Oh my God. Well, thank you for buying it for your daughters. That's so nice. Pretty closely, I have to say. I, was a teenager in the 90s at kind of the height of sex positive feminism. So I very much found myself in agreement with Judy, learning more about her views in terms of sharing about bodies for children. And I'm a parent too, so I kind of walk the walk. I do feel very strongly that my son should have access to information about his body, even prior to things like puberty. And then in terms of censorship as well, I think that I hadn't given it a ton of thought, but that once I was steeped in Judy Blume's work and experience and understanding her as an anti-censorship pioneer, I felt really inspired by her. I felt that it aligns very much with my own personal belief system, and that we all owe a debt to Judy for fighting that good fight in the 80s, and maybe owe her more than a debt, owe her paying it back a little bit now that we're facing some of these same issues again.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of feel like we should back up just a little bit though, and talk about Judy's own journey in publishing, because it's a pretty interesting one, and it really lays the groundwork for a lot of the social and cultural history that you talk about in the book. Can you, Karen from Brewster Ladies Library, saying, what made a publisher take a chance on Judy Blume originally? So we know that she was working toward writing a book for a while, but it didn't happen immediately.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite parts of Judy's story, which was that she was not an overnight success. And I think many of us who grew up reading Judy Blume can't really picture a world in which Judy Blume is not publishing a book every year, that she was actually a struggling creative person. So Judy did not grow up wanting to be a writer. She tried a lot of creative things as a child. She kind of dabbled with dance and theater, and she edited the school newspaper. And it wasn't until she had kids that she thought, maybe I'm going to try writing children's books, because I think, like many of us, once you're reading children's books to your kids, and it kind of seems deceptively easy, right? You're like, oh, I could do that. And of course, it's not easy at all. But she ended up taking a class called Writing for Children and Young Adults at NYU, and her teacher, a woman named Lee Wyndham, really encouraged her. What made a publisher take a chance on her? It's actually kind of an interesting story. So she responded to an ad from a new publisher that was called Bradley Press, and it was started by two editors, one of them being named Dick Jackson. And they had a vision of publishing books for what we would now call middle grade readers. So that was not really as much of a publishing category as it is today. There were great picture books. There were wonderful books that, kind of children and adults could share, like chapter books, but there wasn't anything specifically geared towards like the 8 to 12 reader. And they took out an ad in, some trade magazine, and Judy Blume responded to it, and she wasn't agented. She sent in the manuscript for what we now know as Iggy's House, which is one of her first middle grade books. And Dick Jackson saw the manuscript. He read it. He felt like it was flawed. He felt like, it wasn't necessarily a work that would stand up to the test of time, but he saw something in Judy's voice that he thought was really special. And he decided to work with her, and he published Iggy's House, kind of taking a chance on her. And then the next manuscript she turned in was Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. So, it's a real argument for taking a chance on somebody and maybe saying, okay, your first book, it's good. It's good. But there's something here that is really special, and I believe in you to, express it at some point in your career.
Yeah, you open, well, I guess structurally, every chapter opens with like a glimpse of a quote. And the quotes aren't always from Judy, and it makes me, what you were just talking about, the ad that Jackson took out, so the best $5,000 I've ever spent. So was this an intentional choice to put these quotes at the beginning to like kind of appeal to the sense of discovery for readers, or was it an editorial choice that was made after you'd done all your writing?
It was an editorial choice. It's really interesting that you asked that, because I turned in the manuscript, and it was actually, it wasn't organized by, my first draft wasn't organized by kind of subject heading the way it is in the final book. And that was one of my editor's biggest pieces of advice. She was like, I think that you need to try a clear organizational strategy. The first draft is what one writer I know affectionately calls the vomit draft, right? You put everything in, it's not as structured as you want it to be, but it's like you need to get it out. And then she was like, I think these signposts would be really helpful, if you try organizing by topic, maybe with a little quote. And she gave me one that for an example, and I forget which one it was, but it was like, once I started doing that, it really kind of like fell into place. I wrote my second draft in like a marathon, and it really helped me kind of clarify my thoughts on how to organize the material and how to approach it.
Well, yeah, it was kind of like, I mean, from the reader's perspective, it was kind of like a little Easter egg, and then you find it how it contextualizes everything within the chapter. So it was very well done.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, I mean, when you're writing nonfiction, you're drawing from so many sources. There's so much material to wrangle. There's sometimes tunnel vision about what belongs and what doesn't. And, that's where a great editor really comes in and says, you need to be giving your reader a little bit of something to hang on to so that they can digest all of this more easily.
I can imagine, in fiction, they call it killing your darlings when you have to like just get rid of a whole bunch. I can imagine for nonfiction, it's probably similar, because you're like, no, those facts are absolutely necessary to understand what else is coming.
Totally. Or it took me like 3 days to find that one piece of information. Like, don't tell me to cut it, but I'm, Judy's story is a real testament to the kind of amazing synergistic relationship one can have with their editor. And I believe so much that writers need editors, that you just really, there is a moment in the process of writing when you just cannot see it clearly anymore, and you need outside feedback.
Yeah. Take a step away. Absolutely. Well, Veronica from LA County is saying, when did Judy Blume write her first book, which you just talked about was Iggy's House. But so I think we can maybe talk about Iggy's House a little bit more, because Blume does end up distancing herself from that, right?
She does. So I believe her first book was published in 1969, and that's the one in the middle is The Green Kangaroo. And that's like more of a straight children's book, and that was not with Bradbury. But the first book that she published in what would become her signature style is Iggy's House, and that was 1970. And Iggy's House is really interesting because immediately you see Judy's taking some pretty serious risks in her writing. The protagonist of that book is a young girl named Winnie Barringer. I believe she's 11, which is kind of like the sweet spot for a lot of Judy's characters, sort of on the cusp of teenage years. And Winnie's best friend's family is selling their house, and they're selling it to a Black family from Detroit. And Winnie watches as her town, which is in New Jersey, just kind of falls to pieces over this. There's like a pretty cartoonishly racist neighbor who's trying to get everyone to sign a petition to stop this sale from going through. And, the book is handling things like redlining and blockbusting and like really serious topics, especially for children. And I think one of the reasons that Judy distances herself from that book is not only because, as an author, when you look back on your first book, you feel a little cringy, but
Yeah.
also I think there is like a little bit of white saviorism in the book, or at least like Winnie is feeling like she can be a savior to this Black family. And yeah, I mean, Judy will say it's not her best work, but again, there's so much in there where you see that like the bravery of her topics, the earnestness of her approach that served her a lot in her later titles.
Mm-hmm. I think I mentioned before, you do a fantastic job of giving us social history on women in publishing, even before Judy, leading up to Judy. Can you talk about this history a bit, especially like books like Harriet the Spy, A Wrinkle in Time, things like that, and how they may have influenced Judy and why Judy's writing was so necessary for the time?
Yeah. So I see someone asked about Beverly Cleary on the side. I just kind of glanced at it. And Beverly Cleary was a huge influence to Judy Blume. And Beverly Cleary was a pioneer in children's lit in her own right, in that she wrote about regular kids, regular families in the
Mhm.
Midwest. Before Beverly Cleary, a lot more of the books that were geared to children were things that we would think of like A Wrinkle in Time, like Roald Dahl, like Charlotte's Web, books that had like fantastical elements. There was a lot of unwritten rules that people were adhering to in children's publishing, and one of them was that the books always had to have a very clear moral. There was an idea that children, when they read, needed to like take away something very tangible and moralistic from the time they spent reading that book. And often the morals were delivered by way of the parents. So the parents were always right, even in Beverly Cleary's work. Like Ramona could be crazy, she could act out, she could crack an egg on her head. But at the end of the day, her parents were there to guide her and teach her how to be a human being. Um, Judy didn't totally agree with this unwritten rule. In her own experience, her parents weren't always right. They didn't always have the answers. She was a parent who felt like she wasn't always right and didn't always have the answers. And she wanted to be truer to that childhood experience of like Winnie Barringer in Iggy's house, looking around at your parents and saying, like, why the hell aren't you doing anything? Um, I feel as a child that something is wrong and the adults in my life are not responding. So that was kind of like one of the big molds that Judy broke, was that, she could write about regular kids with regular thoughts and problems, and the adults weren't always going to save them or tell them the right thing to do. They kind of had to figure it out for themselves.
Mhm. And the kids didn't even always do the right thing in the end. As to Cheryl's question there, can we talk about Blubber at some point? I so enjoyed the message and the appeal of that book, very thought-provoking. And it definitely was, especially for that time.
I remember Blubber is one of the books I remember reading, and I remember it made my stomach like clench because it was so cruel. But it was cruel in this way that's really true to life. This is
Mhm.
a book about bullying. This is a book about mean girls putting a target on another girl because of the way she looks and just being awful to her throughout the entire story. And the adults in the book are checked out. The teacher, she doesn't really care or notice or do anything about the bullying that's going on in her classroom. And Blubber was actually banned quite a bit, which surprised Judy and actually surprised me because a lot of the other books of Judy's that have been banned are books that prominently feature bodies, puberty, sexuality, etc. And Blubber doesn't do any of that. But again, Blubber kind of goes against the grain in this idea that books have to have a moral, that books for children need to have someone saying at the end, you cannot act like this, you cannot bully your friends. Um, the bullies get away with it in Blubber, and the only kind of moralizing part of it is that one of the girls who's doing the bullying, when she finally realizes that what she's doing is wrong, she stands up for Blubber, the girl who's being bullied, and she becomes a target too. And Blubber, whose name is Linda, she doesn't defend the narrator. She actually starts bullying her, right back. So the bullied becomes the bully, and yeah, there's not a clear indictment of the behavior. It's just sort of like this is how children behave, and all of us who have been children know that to be true.
Yes, it's just what it is.
Yeah.
Um, so speaking of book bans, because of course there are definitely a lot of questions around that because Judy's books as Janet from Snow Isle Libraries is saying, are still being banned. So why do you think Judy's books are still being banned? Are Americans still prudish?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, we're kind of backsliding this day.
Yeah. Americans are prudish, and Americans are particularly prudish when it comes to our kids. We really don't like, as a culture, to have those awkward conversations with their children. And um, I could go on and on about why that's problematic, but I will say that Judy's books are not banned as frequently as they were in the 1980s. In in the 80s, she was sort of target number one. There was a moment when she was the country's most banned author, and it was because so many of her books were being banned at once. So Margaret, Blubber, Forever being the big one. For those of you who haven't read Forever, Forever is about two teenagers who fall in love and ends up having sex. And the book is quite frank in its depiction of like losing virginity and having sex and enjoying it and finding pleasure in it. And that book was banned a ton, and it was banned actually last summer in Utah. So it does continue to be banned. However, the books that are really being banned now are much more books about LGBTQ issues, about Black lives, about Black history, about trans rights. So while Judy still is banned, she's not like the poster child for book banning the way she was in the 1980s.
Yeah. Caitlin from Cuyahoga County Public Library wants to know, what do we and our children miss out on when Judy Blume's books and similar books are branded as smut and even pulled from the shelves? Personally, I grew up in a super conservative family, and I think I was only able to read Judy Blume because my mom was ignorant to its contents. It opened my worldview. So what do we lose?
Well, I think she just said it in her question, right? It opens her worldview. And I think so many children feel that way because there are things that children perceive in the world around them that they don't know how to put language to. There are things that children are experiencing in their bodies that they don't know how to put language to. And these books help them do that and help them feel normal. A lot of people have issues with Deenie, and Deenie was also frequently banned because in a book about a girl who's dealing with scoliosis and has to wear a back brace, Judy put in a very small masturbation subplot. And she has said she did that because what she would have loved as a child was something that reflected back to her that, self-pleasure was normal. And ultimately, like, these books kind of validate a child's experience in a way that I think is really beautiful. And I think they don't always get that validation from their parents. They don't always get it from schools. They don't always get it from their peers. This is information from what feels like the source of knowledge, which is Judy Blume, which is why we all love her so much, and these books can actually spark conversations with parents. That's something that I really love to talk about, which is that, like, if a child reads something that they don't understand, wouldn't you rather they come to you as a parent versus go wherever else they might go, especially in 2025. So I think there's so much value to these books.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Opal says, early on, the book discusses the difference between the first wave of feminism, basically as women fighting for the right to vote and how it didn't stick, and the women's movement, or the second wave of feminism. Why is it important to clarify the difference of those two movements in this book?
Well, this was kind of my eureka moment for this book, right? I had spent a lot of time researching and rereading and reading, Beverly Cleary and doing all the things to try to understand what story I wanted to tell. And I was also revisiting second wave feminist texts. So, like you said, the first wave of feminism is the suffragists. The second wave was what we think of as 1970s activists marching down Fifth Avenue. And so I read The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. I read Sexual Politics by Kate Millett. I was reading all of these books, and I was noticing a theme in all of them, which was saying that the feminist movement, the original feminist movement in this country, which was the suffragists, after they won the vote in 1919, the whole movement kind of collapsed. There had been no investment in a multi-generational buy-in, right? The women that were campaigning for the vote they were exhausted, and once they got it, it was like they didn't really have anything else that they wanted to fight for, and they weren't educating their daughters necessarily to take up the mantle. So the second waivers were saying over and over, we need to pick it up where the first waivers left off, and we need to make sure that once we get what we want, that the movement will go on. And I believe that Judy Blume has been kind of like an unheralded hero in second wave feminism, in that she was absorbing the messages that were coming to her through the media, through watching women march down Fifth Avenue, through watching Susan Brown Miller on the Dick Cavett show, reading, the cover story of Kate Millett on Time magazine, and that she was absorbing all these messages and she was putting them into her books.
Mhm.
And by putting them into her books, she was sort of training the next generation and the next generation of young girls to understand the prerogatives of the feminist movement. And I think she really accomplished that.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, like you said, it helped move the feminist movement forward and kept it progressing.
Yes.
Andrea says, you open chapter 6 with the Judy quote, "In my heart, I was out there marching." Oh, I'm sorry, that was Karen. I read the wrong line. What do you think Judy would make of the recent backtracking of women's reproductive rights and women's rights in general in the current political climate? After her kids were grown, did she actually get out there and march?
I don't know that she marched, but her cause really became standing up against censorship. And that's what she continues to do. So she remains invested in the ACLU, in the National Organization Against Censorship. There's a new organization called Authors Against Book Bans that I know that she's involved in. So that's what she really fights for. But, Judy is very clear that she is a liberal and she does not believe in the rollback of women's rights. I mean, I think let's make no mistake that that's not something that Judy would approve of. So I think we can be sure that even if she's not, standing on the lawn in DC protesting, like she's doing it in her own way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Gail from Bethlehem Public Library says, I was in library school studying with Zena Sutherland, a friend of Judy's. We discussed potty books and Forever and other Blume works because at the time they were groundbreaking. How, if at all, do you think the impact of Blume's books has evolved or changed?
A lot of people ask me if kids still read Judy Blume the way that we all did. And I think the answer is no. And I think in part it's because Judy's impact continues to spiral out into the current landscape of children's books, which is there are so many more options, and there are so many people writing middle grade and YA, and there are so many people tackling really brave topics. I mean, just look at The Fault in Our Stars, right? This, a book about a girl dying of cancer would not have been published in 1970, right? And so I think Judy's impact, it's felt today, and even if people aren't picking up her books, they're picking up books that have been really directly influenced by her.
Yeah, absolutely. Lee from Beyond the Pages Virtual Author Talk says, one thing that struck me hardest while watching Judy Blume on a masterclass was how she felt so close with Margaret. I think she even said she missed her since she was no longer writing the stories. Do you have any thoughts about that, or had you heard that or read that about Judy before?
I've never heard her say that she missed Margaret, although that doesn't surprise me. Margaret's very autobiographical, actually.
Okay.
So not necessarily Margaret's issues with religion, because Judy was raised pretty clearly Jewish. But a lot of details in Margaret were taken directly from Judy's life experience as a girl that age. So, Margaret's in the PTKs, the preteen kittens. Judy was in a group that I don't remember, or no, the PTSs, the preteen sensations, and Judy was in the preteen kittens. So she really took a lot of these very cute details from her own life and put them into Margaret. Judy says that she had kind of a very informal, non-religious relationship to God, where she spoke to him like he was her friend. And, obviously that's in Margaret as well. So,
yeah.
So yeah, I think that it doesn't surprise me that she feels like she misses Margaret. She wrote that book very quickly. It seemed to like have emerged from deep inside of her. Sometimes as a writer, like sometimes it's a struggle and sometimes it's like there's a story just waiting to come out. And I think that's what Margaret was for her.
Okay. And adding kind of autobiographical elements to characters, Margaret wasn't the only time that she really did that. Alicia from Ascension Parish Library saying how much of starring Sally J. Friedman as herself was taken from Blume's own life. Alicia continues, it was the second book I ever read about Jewish families, and it was so very different from the very Catholic family and city I grew up in. So this was a wonderful introduction to Judaism.
Yeah, she said that Sally J. Friedman is her most autobiographical book.
Okay.
So Sally's older brother is sickly. Judy's older brother, David, was sickly. Because of that, the family moves down to Miami so that he can convalesce. That's what Judy's family did as well. So it's very much about Judy being a creative child in the post-World War II era. Sally has a lot of kind of like weird fantasy games about Hitler, just because Hitler is so much a part of her consciousness. And that was true for Judy as well. So there's a moment in my book when I talk about Sally J. Friedman getting kind of publicly panned. And while Judy had kind of grown accustomed to getting maybe not so nice reviews, that one really hurt her because it did feel much more personal than some of her other books.
Yeah. Makes sense. Adam says, what would you say are some of the most common perceptions and misconceptions about Judy Blume and her work?
Well, one of the perceptions that I was trying to interrogate in my book was the idea that she wasn't writing anything worthwhile, that her books weren't literary. I think you can argue as to whether or not they're quote unquote literary because she's not a very flowery writer. And certainly during her heyday in the 70s and 80s, she got a lot of reviews that dismissed her books as quote junk food. Someone described her writing as shopping list prose. So again, it's this idea that, she wasn't adding anything to the cultural conversation just because she was writing accessible books mostly for a female audience. Ironically, it wasn't until she started getting pretty aggressively banned that people started rethinking her work in that context, because suddenly her name was being put out there alongside writers like Mark Twain and Solzhenitsyn and Maya Angelou. So all of a sudden people are saying, wait, if Judy Blume deserves to be banned like these other canonical great writers, maybe her name does belong in that conversation. And I would argue that it very much does. I would argue that she, is truly a groundbreaking writer, and the style of her prose kind of has nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Some questions were coming in about kind of the male perspective on Judy Blume, and Daria from Rutgers University Library says, do you think it's important for men to read these books as well? And were there any men that Judy kind of had to battle with as she was coming up as a writer?
Her editor was male, so I mean, he was her greatest champion.
Yeah, he was a big champion for her.
Yeah. I don't know about battling. The shopping list prose writer was a writer named David Rees, who wrote a book, actually. He's an English writer. He wrote a book on the status of writing for children in the late 80s, and he wrote an essay called Not Even for a One Night Stand, Judy Blume. And he was particularly harsh about her work. And I would say particularly misogynistic. Again, it was like, well, she's writing about periods, so what could she possibly be contributing to the world? And it's like, well, if you've ever met a teenage girl, they might actually be caring about periods because that's something that's happening to them and it's new. I do think boys can get a lot out of reading Judy Blume. First of all, the Fudge books, which are for a slightly younger reader than, say, Forever and Margaret, are about boys. Peter Hatcher is a male narrator. Fudge is a boy. I read those books with my son, and he thought they were hilarious. Then again, Maybe I Won't also is kind of like much less celebrated, but it's like a take on Margaret from a boy's perspective. It's similar, a boy of a similar age going through puberty, kind of questioning his family's choices. I would very much like my son to keep reading Judy Blume. I think like books are one of the great ways we learn empathy. And just because he's not a young girl doesn't mean there's no reason for him to understand what his female friends might be going through in a couple years. So yeah, I think boys can get plenty out of them.
Absolutely, I agree. Mark is also commenting, one thing that always impressed me about Then Again, Maybe I Won't, is that besides the sexual content and how well Judy writes adolescent males, it very deftly explores privilege and wealth, especially in the classic tip in the milkshake scene. What was Judy's financial situation as she grew up?
She was raised very middle class. Her dad was a successful dentist. Her mom was a homemaker. She grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which was a very diverse middle class city. And then she married her first husband, John Bloom, who was kind of an up and coming lawyer. So she always had, she never lived in poverty. She always had financial opportunity. When she lived with John Bloom, I think, they joined a country club and ate out at restaurants. So I think they were doing fine. And she has said pretty publicly that it wasn't until she started making her own money that she felt like she might be able to get divorced, because then the financial part of the divorce wasn't going to be such a huge problem for them. So she was never poor. Then again, maybe I won't, does explore that really interesting dynamic when a family that is kind of blue collar ends up striking it wealthy and then, moves to a fancy enclave of Long Island, and the son, the narrator, has a little bit of whiplash over that. But I don't think that was Judy's experience. I think she made that one up.
Mm-hmm. Liz from Las Vegas, Clark County Library District, is saying, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Judy Blume during your research?
I think, like I said, that she wasn't a born writer, that she wasn't someone who had aspired to be a writer her whole life, that she tried a bunch of different creative things even as an adult before she got to writing. So she thought she might write songs. She made felt pendants to sell, to hang in children's rooms, and that actually was kind of successful for a minute. But she developed an allergy to the fabric glue, so she had to find something else. It's like she played around in a lot of different sandboxes before she found writing. And I kind of love that about her, to be honest, because I think those of us who write professionally constantly hit up against roadblocks. I mean, it's just part of the job. And so it felt very cool and relatable to know that she had as well.
Well, you kind of have your own unconventional story in terms of breaking into publishing. Leah from Detroit Public Library is saying, did you always want to be an author? And when in your life did you know that you had made it as an author? Can you talk to us about your journey?
When in any day now, I mean, I think I have no idea. But yeah, I always wanted to be a writer. The dream kind of aged with me. So when I was little, I told people that I wanted to write children's books because I just loved to read. And I think I had a knack for words. And I think I got a lot of positive feedback from my teachers about my writing that sort of just added to the idea that that's what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea how to do it. I went to liberal arts school and I loved it and I thrived academically, but then I graduated out into the world and I was like, well, wait, how am I supposed to do this? And I ended up, after a year-long stint working as a cocktail waitress and thinking I was going to, write the great American novel on the side, which I did not. I ended up working for a literary agent and I just kind of vowed to learn the business. And I stayed there first full-time and then part-time for 12 years. And I learned everything I could about publishing, and I worked there while I wrote my first book. I found my agent actually working there, which feels a little bit like a publishing Cinderella story because it's not what happens all the time. But I thought to myself, when I first got that job, maybe I would want to be an editor. I wanted to sort of test the waters because I felt like that would be an easier career path. Um, and I do work as an editor. I do work as a freelance editor. But I quickly realized like I know I really needed to pursue this dream of being a writer, and I was going to see if I could make it happen.
Mm-hmm. So why nonfiction then? So you said you started writing a book while working at the literary agency, and Tracy from Monmouth County Library is saying, what has inspired you to write nonfiction about such different topics, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and how the through thread of each of them. But Sydney is adding, how do you find these book ideas, and why nonfiction?
I really love writing nonfiction. I feel like it gives me kind of interesting parameters, if that makes sense. Like I like the detective aspect of it.
Mhm. Yeah.
I love doing research. I love trying to find people and talking to them and getting, downloading their expertise. And I also feel like it can be very overwhelming to sit in front of a blank page and write fiction and just be like, I could write about anything. Like, oh my God, the possibilities are endless. Like nonfiction gives me some nice guardrails. It gives me just like a fence to put around the work. And yeah, I love learning. So it's given me an opportunity to do these deep dives. Like my second book was on diamonds, and I got to learn the diamond industry from people who have spent multiple generations working in it. And like that to me is so much fun, being able to speak to people who know their stuff and explain it to me, and then having to explain it to other people. Like I just love it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a gift in and of itself, is to be able to translate it to readers in a way that's digestible. And then it's going into your head too, like all of this, the terms of art of these industries, and then like you're putting it back out to make it entertaining and amazing for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Megan from Pennington Public Library says, in what ways do you find writing cathartic for your own experiences?
Oh my God. I think that writing is very much how I process the world. I find it's one of the few things that gets me into that flow state.
Mhm.
Like I'm naturally kind of anxious and buzzy. And so writing, swimming in the ocean, these are just like a couple of the ways that I can turn off that sound. So in some ways, I think it's like an adaptation, it's like, I don't know, it just makes me feel good. And it's very much, it does feel like a purging at times, even if I'm not writing about, for some people, it has to be writing about yourself. For me, just like putting myself in the headspace of another character can feel really enlivening.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of a different kind of adaptation, Emma is saying, what are your thoughts on the recent media adaptations of Judy's books? Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and Forever. What are your thoughts on keeping the adaptation based in the time period they were written versus modernizing the stories?
So I actually really liked both of them. And they are different in that Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. They approached as a period piece. It's very much in the 1970s, and the New Forever adaptation, it takes place in like 2023 LA. So totally different approaches. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is quite faithful to the book in most ways, and the Forever adaptation is a very loose adaptation, in which it kind of like takes the kernel of the central relationship between the two teenagers and then like really builds it out. So, but I think they did a great job with both. And I think that's one of the smarter things that Judy Blume has done, is that she's held onto her material until she found the right person to do the adaptation. So I think, she was an executive producer on Forever, and I think she was on Margaret as well. So like she had her hand in both, kind of making sure that it felt at least at heart true to her work. And I think they accomplished that with both of them.
Yeah, I watched the Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and I haven't watched Forever yet, but I thought that the first one was great. So Joanne has a research question about interviews. Did you
Mm.
interview people for this book? Did you do any interviews and or oral histories? Joanne is saying, have you interviewed children and parents who read who read Judy Blume books to get their perspectives?
So I did do a lot of interviews. I interviewed someone who had worked at Bradley Press during the height of Judy's career. I interviewed sex educators, librarians. I interviewed the guy who starred in the 1978 movie adaptation of Forever. Um, I interviewed a woman now named Karen Fleshman, who circulated a petition at her school as like a fifth grader to try to get Judy's books back on the shelves after they were removed. I interviewed a man named Mickey Dishno who lost his job over fighting with the principal over removing Forever. So yeah, it was like a real grab bag, and I love doing these interviews. I feel that, again, just talking to people about their experiences and expertise and then being able to translate it is a privilege and really, really fun for me.
There was an interesting tidbit I remember reading in the book where you talk about Judy picking up the phone and somebody asking if she was the author of, I can't remember what book the example gave, but and she said yes, and the woman yells communist and hangs up. And then and then you talk about how today we use much different terminology to mean the same thing when it comes to censorship and book banning and things like that. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think communist in the 1970s was what someone would say like woke is now, like it was an insult, and it was just someone coming from like the more conservative side. It was about Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. So,
That's right. That's
Judy had, I think, a fair amount of success with the book. It wasn't really controversial when it first came out, which is interesting. But yeah, someone called her a communist. And I think, yeah, it would be the equivalent of calling someone and calling them like woke today. It's
Mhm.
just like um, they thought she was being a bad influence, which is an accusation that has followed her throughout her life.
Yeah, it's following a lot of authors these days. Like you spoke about different books that were being banned earlier, and it's also attaching itself to libraries and librarians with indoctrination, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was interesting to see kind of the difference in like the words meaning the same thing, but they're being applied to something that actually has no relevance at all.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of still a misnomer that like getting banned is somehow good for the writer because it adds
Right.
attention to the book. And I think what I tried to show in Judy's story and what writers who are being banned now are trying to communicate is that it's actually deeply hurtful and offensive. Like when you pour yourself into a book and then someone claims that it's bad for children or that it's indoctrinating them or that it's pornographic. I mean, these are really harrowing accusations, and you know, what small amount of publicity a writer is going to get from enduring that is not worth it.
Right. They're scary. It's scary accusations too, some of them.
Totally.
Amy from Mill Valley Public Library says, what advice do you have for girls and young women today, given our current state of affairs in this country? Which, I mean, whether or not taking current state of affairs out of it, I'm sure there's plenty of advice for girls and young women today. Read Judy Blume.
Read Judy Blume and use your voice. I mean, I think that's a message that goes across many of Judy's books for children, which is use your voice, trust your gut, speak out when you see injustice. These are messages that are timeless and that I think we can very much apply to our current situation.
Absolutely. Allison from Mawa Public Library says, do you think it's harder to be a kid now than it was 40 years ago?
I don't know. I mean, I would think, I'm raising a 9-year-old and it seems hard, but it was hard back then too. I do think like social media and AI and things like that are adding new wrinkles on old problems. Everything seems to be a bit accelerated and a bit more intense. But, issues of self-esteem and body image and competitiveness with friends, those aren't new.
No.
So I don't know. I hope that I think there are probably advantages and disadvantages to growing up in 2025 versus 1985.
Sure. Absolutely. Peter and several other people are asking for some words of wisdom about for first-time authors or aspiring nonfiction writers who want to write about women's issues. Any words of wisdom for getting published and going on that track?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the great thing about the internet is that you can put your ideas out there on places like Substack and potentially build an audience. That's also the bad thing about the internet because publishers expect you to do that now, and it's unpaid labor in a lot of cases. But I would say, like, write about things that you genuinely feel passionate about. I mean, I think that's a huge part of reaching your reader in nonfiction, because nonfiction can feel very dry, right? But if you're truly passionate about it, if you're having fun while you're writing it, if you really feel like there's something that you need to get across when you're doing this, all of these things will be apparent to the reader.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of research, we did have several people over the course of this hour ask about kind of how long you research and when you know you're done. And when do you research? Do you do all of your research before you start writing, or are you researching as you're discovering new things and you start writing?
So I wouldn't say that my process is the most like mentally healthy, but I'll share it, which is that when I, secure a contract for a book, I'll start researching. And obviously I have researched before I get a contract because you have to do research to write a book proposal. But like once I
And also
sign a contract,
nonfiction, right? Nonfiction querying is different than fiction querying. So nonfiction, you write a proposal instead of submitting a draft. Is that right?
exactly. So I've been researching to write that book proposal. And then once I sign the contract, I start researching. And I research until my brain feels full and I cannot sleep because it's all I can think about. And then I realize I have to start getting something down on the page because my brain's going to pop and I can't fit anything else in there anymore. So then I'll start writing. And then sometimes like that's probably not a whole book's amount of research. So then I'll just kind of repeat that over and over. I do try to stay more or less chronological in my writing. I just feel like I'm kind of linear in my thinking, and that's the best approach for me. I know other people do it differently, but yeah, it involves like kind of just filling up and up and up and up on all of the information I can get my hands on, and then eventually feeling like I have no choice but to sit down and write something.
Are you outlining during that time? Are you putting sticky notes all over a room? How are you organizing the information?
So I keep like a notebook, and I'll write what probably look like homicidal maniac notes in that notebook, but yeah, like a structure does tend to come together like through that process. But again, like there's tunnel vision. So like when I wrote my first draft, got notes from my editor and then went back to it, I was like, why? Like this circuitous, I came back to forever, like 8 different times in the manuscripts, and it made no sense, like why I had chosen that structure, which apparently made perfect sense to me when I was sitting down to write. So I think when you are, I mean, any book is going to take a number of drafts, but I think when you're wrangling like a huge amount of information, like you are with nonfiction writing, sometimes there's a process of kind of like untangling the knots after you get it all out on paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was your favorite Judy Blume book then? What made the biggest impression on you?
So like I said, I think it's Just As Long As We're Together. Although Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is a close second, because I really think Margaret is like a perfect book. It's just like a beautiful encapsulation of adolescence. I was raised in a dual faith family, and so that was the first time reading that book that I saw that experience reflected in a character. So yeah, the two of those books. I don't think I can pick just one.
That's okay. You don't have to. Yeah. I'm going to make you pick another book right now. Mary from Wallingford Public Library says, what is a book that you've read recently that you recommend everyone runs out to the library to check out immediately?
Okay, so I have it right here. Okay. I bought this book on a whim. I know it's going to be reversed, but it's the David Lynch book, Catching the Big Fish, about transcendental meditation and creativity. I bought it on a whim after David Lynch died. It was like in the front display at my local bookstore. And I love David Lynch, but this book really had a pretty intense impact on me. Like it's all about how he learned to meditate and then let the ideas kind of flow through him and not really question them as much. And I think we could all really take a page out of that book, you know, where you're like, just trust your instincts as a creator and make yourself into a vessel so that the ideas can flow as freely and creatively as possible. I loved it.
Being a vessel is kind of a reoccurring thing that authors tend to say when we're in these talks. So I
Hmm.
love that you just used that wording there. That was
That's so
amazing.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, well, what a great stopping point. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been truly a pleasure to talk to you for the last hour. Thank you so much for your amazing book.
Oh, thank you so much. And it was really so fun to talk to you about it.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to our viewers for tuning into the Author Talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible, and we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll down below the live stream video, you can see the resources area, which contains a link to Rachelle's book. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a good day.